The event is organized by GIZ India and IIT Bombay under the Forum for Decarbonizing Transport. The Forum, a Niti Aayog-led platform under the NDC Transport Initiative for Asia project, is a one-step platform for initiating dialogues between stakeholders and partners that will help in achieving specific results and in reducing emissions from the transport sector. We would like to inform you that today's session would be recorded for further knowledge sharing pursuits. I now invite Mr. Henrik Persson, Head of Solar Projects and Team Leader of our e-mobility project in the CTIA, the Indian component, to provide the opening remarks and the welcome address. Over to you, Mr. Persson.
Thank you, Kshitij. Thank you very much. Honorable guests, I see over 100 participants. So everyone, ladies, gentlemen, colleagues, partners, good evening from my side. As Kshitij already mentioned, Henrik Persson, my name, team leader for e-mobility and also head of solar projects here at GIZ India. So today's workshop is on EV charging infrastructure and its grid integration in India, gap analysis and recommendations for seamless adoption of EV charging. This workshop is based on our so-called Report 3, which falls under a series of 4 reports, which are all under the comprehensive study integration of electric vehicles, charging infrastructure with distribution grid, global review, India's gap analysis, and the way forward. You don't have to keep all these titles in mind. You can just download the reports when they're finished, and you will have it black and white. But firstly, let me speak out some words of thanks and appreciation, please. So I would really like to thank Niti Aayog. Under their leadership, we are implementing this. Mr. Sinha, without your guidance, the study would not have been possible. So thank you very much for your guidance and leadership. And also, hopefully, if you have joined already, for your valuable time. Nevertheless, I would, of course, also like to thank Dr. Zakir from IIT Bombay for the great work he and his team has conducted so far. We are more than happy with the outcome of this report. Thank you, Dr. Zakir, for this. This is really a great job. I would also like to thank my team. They're showing really an exceptional dedication to the decarbonization of the Indian transport sector. They have been a great help with the overall project implementation. So please keep on the good work. Talking about the project, Kshitij already has mentioned a little bit about it, but as you may know, the nationally determined contribution transport initiative for Asia is part of the International Climate Initiative, shortly ICI. The German Federal Ministry of the Environment, Natural Conservation, Nuclear Safety and Consumer Protection, shortly BMUV, supports this initiative based on a decision adopted by the German Parliament. So shortly, NDC-TIA is a joint project of 7 organizations, ICCT, ITF, WRI, Agora, REN24, SLOCAT, and GIZ. Many colleagues are also on the call here today, and has been implemented in India, China, and Vietnam. The NDC-TIA project aims at promoting a comprehensive approach on decarbonizing transport and coherent strategy of effective policies that are coordinated among various sector ministries, civil society, and the private sector. The activities under the NDC-TIA India component are carried out in close collaboration with the implementation partner Niti Aayog, Government of India. The workshop today is based on the findings of our 3rd report, Electric Vehicle Charging Infrastructure and its Grid Integration in India, Status Quo, Critical Analysis, and the Way Forward. This specific report is the 3rd report in the series of 4 reports and focused on detailed documentation and analysis of EV charging infrastructure and grid integration in the Indian EV ecosystem, covering the current status and various aspects, including EV charging technologies. But it also looks into standards and protocols which are applicable in India, the grid integration status of EVs, stakeholders in the Indian EV ecosystem, policies, regulatory matters related to EV charging, both at central and state level. Moreover, a gap analysis in EV charging infrastructure and its grid integration in Indian EV ecosystem is also presented. Since the Indian EV market currently constitutes of mainly two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and four-wheelers, the main focus of this report is passengers vehicles only and doesn't look in depth to freight. With this workshop, we aim to disseminate the knowledge that was created and continue this discussion around the findings of the so-called Report 3. Having said this, I would like to thank IIT Bombay, the Florence School of Regulation, the Technical University of Denmark, Cardiff University, and Comillas Pontifical University for conducting and contributing to the study. They all have been a great help in this study and have done a great job. As I really look forward to further keynotes, and we are also a little bit over time, I don't want to speak too long, and I wish us all a fruitful outcome of this workshop and would hand over to Kshitij again so we can continue with the agenda. Welcoming you all again. Thank you very much and wish you all a good workshop. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Pezon, for the welcoming address. Unfortunately, Mr. Sudhendu J. Sinha has been having some other tasks to do, which has been taking more time than usual. So we'll be waiting for his joining. So then we could actually start off with the presentation to share some key findings from our study. The presentation would be conducted by Professor Zakir Hussain Ratar from the Department of Energy Science and Engineering, IIT Bombay. I now give over to Professor Zakir to start with the presentation.
Thank you, Kshitij. I hope you are able to see the presentation in the presentation mode.
Yes, Dr. Zakir, perfectly.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So a very good evening to all the participants attending this specific workshop, which is on this electric vehicle charging infrastructure and its grid integration, looking at gap analysis in the Indian EV ecosystem and recommendations for seamless adoption of EV charging infrastructure. So these are the broader contents of this presentation that we will be discussing during this time that has been allocated for this particular presentation, but we'll have some more related discussion in the panel discussion that is scheduled afterwards. This presentation is a short gist or summary of the report 3 that has been talked about earlier and which is already published. And a part of this presentation are the findings from report 4, which is in the draft stage and is likely to be published in next one to 2 months. So this gives the broader picture of this whole study, integration of electric vehicle charging infrastructure in the Indian EV ecosystem, where we have published 3 reports so far. One is fundamentals of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, charging technology, and it is grid integration aspects, looking at the grid integration. Then we have had report 2, which details out quite a bit in detail the international review, both industry and the research review of these electric vehicle integration that have particularly been happening in some of the EV-rich countries in Europe and America. Then, as we have been mentioning, this workshop is to a large extent covering part of this work, study done in this report 3, which is a study specific to Indian EV charging infrastructure and its integration in the Indian grid. And then the report 4 that I mentioned is in the draft stage and should be published shortly. But some of the findings of the report 4 I'll be presenting as a part of this presentation, and we'll be also seeking some feedback inputs from you while we are conducting this workshop. So some basic figures which majority of the audience working in the EV sector would be knowing. In Indian EV ecosystem, we have roughly around 20.5 lakh EVs already on road at the moment, which are predominantly three-wheelers and two-wheelers, accounting for around 1900,000, and the rest are this light duty electric vehicles, around 83,000. And the numbers are actually rapidly growing. If we compare the growth of the electric vehicles that are brought on the road every year, and we are having ambitious targets for 2030 and beyond, as we know. However, if you look at the percentage share of these electric vehicles in the overall fleet of vehicles, the percentage seems to be very low, even though the numbers may be high, for example, for two-wheeler, three-wheeler, but the percentage share is low. So on one hand, it is actually indicating that we are at the nascent stage of the electrification of our transportation, but on the other hand, it is actually providing us a great opportunity to plan our charging infrastructure, which is one of the very, very critical component of adoption for adoption of electric vehicles in any country. There has been a survey, if I remember correctly, it was in California sometime, I think a decade ago, on the EV owners who switched back from electric vehicle to the conventional vehicle. So 70% of the respondents actually cited the reason of lack of adequate charging infrastructure as a reason for switching back to the conventional electric vehicles. So that gives an idea how important and critical adequate charging infrastructure is for adoption of electric vehicles. So therefore, that looking at these different EV-rich countries which have actually experienced electric vehicle penetration over last 3 to 4 decades now, have got a lot of experience, have a lot of development in this EV integration. There's a lot of learnings from them, and of course the customization of those learnings for Indian specific application. So if we look at the charging technology in terms of the connectors that we have in India, we started back early with this Bharat AC 001 with 3.3 kilowatt charger, and then Bharat type 2 AC in terms of AC chargers. And then if we look at the DC chargers, we have had this Bharat DC 001 charger. We have CCS2 charger and CHAdeMO chargers. Of course, in practice on road, we don't have CHAdeMO chargers as such in the market, but of course they are technically part of the Indian connectors in Indian EV ecosystem. So looking at the public charging infrastructure, we have roughly around 7,000 public charging stations in the country, with rough approximate distribution among the different states shown on this slide, with several states having already, as we will learn down the line, having already electric vehicle policy, dedicated EV policies with various incentives and policy-driven interventions for adoption of electric vehicles in the country. And if we look from the perspective of who has put these chargers, PSUs, there are 24 approximately PSUs who have put chargers of around 3,000. So the numbers seem to be quite high for PSUs compared to others, players. But this is primarily driven by the FAME scheme, which where these PSUs have been on, putting up through that scheme. These PSUs have been putting up the charging infrastructure. But then we have healthy list of private CPOs in the country which are actually growing rapidly, and then we have others in the country. Looking at the policy roadmap, I think we started long back in 2010, and then we are currently in the extension phase of FAME 2 policies, and over the years we have had several schemes incentivizing and pushing for the adoption of electric vehicles. So this map actually shows how much focus is there on the EV, on the efforts towards adoption of EVs. Majority of the states have already electric vehicle policies, electric vehicle specific policies. Most of them have already finalized. Some states have even the next second EV policies, and then some states have in the draft phase. But the idea to show here is that looking at the policy analysis that we did under this study for the entire country, including the schemes at the central level and the policies at the state level, there is actually an attempt across the states, across the country, both at central and state level, to push these electrification of the transportation. Looking at that was the policy side. Looking at the regulation side, we have some regulations in place for electric vehicle charging. We're talking primarily about technical regulations. For example, we have some regulations by CA, and then we have had charging infrastructure guidelines from MOP from time to time, with this one, Jan 2022 one being the latest one. But there is a room for a lot of improvement in the technical regulations for electric vehicles. For example, if we look at this, one of the countries that we have analyzed it on the regulations from the electric vehicle policy, you can electric vehicle integration, you can see how the regulations are actually detailed out, how precise the regulations are in terms of the connection requirements, in terms of the controllability requirements of the electric vehicles or the batteries, mobile batteries that would be connected to the grid. So there is need for working on these electric vehicle regulations. Now the gaps in Indian EV charging ecosystem that we have done through this study, a detailed study, can be actually classified into different categories, which cannot be discussed or even listed here in detail, which are detailed out in the report to a great extent. But some of them are actually listed here. Regulatory gaps, policy gaps that we have identified and analyzed and actually noted in the report. Charging infrastructure related gaps, vehicle to anything related gaps, vehicle to grid, and other smart charging related gaps that are there in Indian EV ecosystem. Integration of electric vehicle with the distribution system, RE-based EV charging, and other related aspects. As I mentioned, not every gap is mentioned in this presentation. So if we have a little quick look at the different gaps that we have identified, some of them are actually listed here. Lack of adequate support for private sector players in charging infrastructure, that's one of the gaps that we have found, again detailed out in our report. Non-optimal allocation of public charging stations under FAME scheme, misalignment between, or you can say room for better alignment is there between subsidy in charging infrastructure and vehicle subsidy. That needs to be harmonized. Lack of incentives for battery swapping, though there is, there has been an attempt to improve further, but still there are some gaps in that direction. Charging infrastructure deployment gaps, major focus on slow chargers, not much focus in terms of, if you look at the policy interventions and subsidies, not much focus on the fast chargers. Lack of standards for two-wheeler and three-wheeler chargers. It is at the moment kind of without any standard, though in four-wheelers there is to some extent standardization there, but in this two-wheeler and three-wheeler segment, that's lacking. Interoperability is another important gap that is identified, one of the critical issues that needs to be actually considered and factored in development of the charging infrastructure in Indian EV ecosystem. And then building bylaws needs to be further strengthened. Similarly, integration of of electric vehicles, when we electrify the transportation sector, it brings in additional load to the distribution system, distribution grid, which that distribution grid had not considered when it was being designed to cater the conventional load in the system. So therefore, at times there is a need for grid upgradation, reinforcement on the grid, and that's a cost that has cost implications, which is currently being actually the responsibility or being managed by the CPOs themselves, and which is quite a daunting factor from the cost perspective. That needs to be addressed. Most of the discoms that we know about their financial status, so therefore there is a need to look at those gaps also, because we are adding this new, not only it's not new load, it is not an additional load, but it's a load with new and different characteristics that actually makes it at the same time challenging, but also it provides an opportunity to utilize this particular charging load in a different way, which can be used for betterment of the grid as well, if used adequately, if managed and used adequately. Challenges from CPO perspective, of course, there are some single window clearance system has been there in some of the states now, but still there is a need for strengthening further in other states. Increased cost of installation, as I mentioned earlier, due to grid upgradation. Land availability is critical factor as well. Need for these suitable business models. Similarly, challenges in smart charging, as I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, we are at the initial stage of adoption of EVs, and according to the EV charging infrastructure, that gives us an opportunity to plan our charging infrastructure in a better way, using the learnings from the other countries, so that we can actually benefit from this new infrastructure, which is having a lot of potential to help in managing the grid. So therefore, better planning for the smart charging would actually be very helpful in managing the EV load down the line. We have identified several gaps in this: lack of communication protocols, communication infrastructure within the distribution system operators or discoms, smart grid infrastructure that would be required. Time-based tariff is there already in their various states, but it's not adequate enough actually to attract the customer at this stage. Lack of dedicated pilot studies to show the smart charging, how it works in Indian EV ecosystem. V2X implementations, as I mentioned, this EV charging load is not a conventional load. It is a different load with different characteristics. It can actually provide a lot of opportunities to the grid, not only to the grid, both EV user, aggregator, grid operator. It can actually benefit different key stakeholders of EV ecosystem if managed, if planned, and operated in a controlled and coordinated manner. Challenges in RE-based EV charging is another aspect that we have identified gaps in this study, and in provision of ancillary services from EVs. EVs provide this a large chunk of mobile storage that is already there, primarily bought for driving the electric vehicle. But if we see the electric vehicle, except let us say the commercial fleets, most of the electric vehicles remain unutilized for majority of the time of the day, and the battery remains unutilized for that majority part of the day. So therefore, having that infrastructure already in place, we could actually use that or make better use of that storage that is there under electric vehicles. But for that, we need, of course, regulations. We need regulations to allow that battery staying under the vehicle to play with the grid, to interact with the grid. There are already in some countries where electric vehicles are providing, frequencies, active power services, or participating in the electricity market in some of the countries. So therefore, there is a need for looking into the regulations aspects that can allow these electric vehicles down the line to interact with the grid, to exchange the power, not only take the power from the grid, but also help in managing the grid in different ways through ancillary services, to demand response and other interactions. Similarly, challenges in communication infrastructure that to some extent I mentioned earlier. We do not have this communication between various stakeholders that you can see on the right side of this flow diagram of these showing different communication standards required between different stakeholders in this entire EV ecosystem chain. As you can see, starting from EV user to EVSC to CPO, EMSP, distribution system operator. Of course, in India it's DISCOM, and then the communication infrastructure, communication protocol is required for them. There's a need to have those standards of communication, protocols of the communication in adequate communication protocols in Indian EV ecosystem that could help us in achieving smart charging and managing this charging load down the line. So that was a kind of quick glimpse of some of the gaps that we have identified. Again, a detailed list of the gaps and details of each gap is actually mentioned in the report 3. So we need to address those gaps. So some of the interventions can be mentioned here as development of charging infrastructure. We need adequate charging infrastructure to manage this charging load. Smart charging there along with various factors that would be required to manage that smart charging. Adequate tariffs would be required. As I mentioned, we already have time of day tariff in some of the states, but it's not adequate enough. Smart charging, both from the infrastructure perspective and the regulations perspective, RE integration for smart charging. Optimal location of public charging stations is very important aspect of adequate aspect for seamless adoption of charging infrastructure in the country. Use of the government land or any other land for putting up the charging infrastructure. There needs to be focus on that as well. Awareness is one of the, based on our study, we have found that mass awareness is one of the very powerful intervention that is required for adoption of any technology, and that is actually true for electric vehicle charging infrastructure and adoption of electric vehicles as well. Grid upgradation, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the critical aspects. Grid upgradation, we may minimize, we may be able to minimize, we definitely will be able to reduce it through smart charging, through coordinated charging, but we cannot avoid it at all. We would definitely need grid upgradation at some point in time to accommodate more electric vehicle charging load. So therefore, there is a need to look at how to adequately have this grid upgradation in place. Who is going to fund this grid upgradation? How is that going to happen? And why there should not be only one stakeholder, burdened with this grid upgradation. Grid interconnection regulations for EVs, as I mentioned, this we have learned a lot from renewable energy integration across the world and definitely in the country as well. Having adequate regulation, grid code regulations help us in smooth and better adoption of the technology, renewable energy integration. Same is true for electric vehicle charging infrastructure integration. The more we electrify the transportation sector, the more we will have the chargers, the more will be the load, additional load on the grid. The more these chargers, high power chargers particularly, that will be connected to the grid, the more will be the need to discipline the charging infrastructure. So therefore, there is need to have this adequate grid code regulations in Indian EV ecosystem, and then of course then long-term mobility plan. So again, this is not the exhaustive list which is detailed out in the report. Now, having identified the gap analysis of different actually factors in Indian EV ecosystem, EV charging ecosystem, policy, regulatory, technical gaps, there is a need to address those gaps and see how we can actually have seamless adoption of electric vehicle charging infrastructure in the country. So this study, this next part of the presentation is findings from our study, which is a part of the report 4 that is under review at the moment and will be published at a later stage, as I mentioned earlier. So what we have done is we have drawn a unique approach, framework, and methodology to arrive at or to determine the key interventions required for this seamless adoption of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So what we did is we have seen, based on the review of different studies, not only on in the electric vehicle sector but also in the energy sector. So we have seen that there is a, particularly in the electrification of the transportation sector, the recommendation is for different dimensions of the electric vehicle adoption in any country have been primarily driven by surveys or expertise of those who are conducting the study, or various combinations of inputs from different industries, relevant industries. But what we have done unique here in this study is that we have not let our framework depend only on surveys, which is very important, not depend only on the industry inputs, which is very important, not only depend on the simple expertise of the experts, but we have also combined all these factors with the scientific methods. So we brought in the scientific methods along with the surveys, along with the stakeholder consultation, along with the inputs from the relevant industry. And we brought all this together in the entire framework and try to determine this key interventions that would be required for seamless adoption of electric vehicle charging infrastructure in Indian EV ecosystem. That's what this slide is actually capturing. In step 1, we took interventions and criteria selection. We identified different possible potential interventions that are there in the system. And then in step 2, we assigned the weightage to different interventions, where we use it, in-house analysis, we use it stakeholder consultation discussions, and then we ranked those interventions, policy and regulatory interventions separate list, and technical interventions separate list. And then what we did is we did in-depth analysis of those interventions to see how each intervention actually will, what it would demand in terms of the economic implications, technical implications, or technical, interaction with the grid. Then we, in the step 5, what we did is we framed a new criteria for selecting, because here we have now the ranking for technical interventions and the policy interventions independently. But we needed the final unified ranking of these. So we clubbed together these interventions, technical and regulatory and policy interventions, using the criteria to arrive at the top ranking interventions required for the seamless adoption of charging infrastructure in the Indian EV ecosystem. So these are the potential interventions that we considered for this analysis. These are technical interventions: fast charging, slow charging, battery swapping, smart charging, unidirectional, smart charging bidirectional, where we'll have vehicle to grid also, interoperability, energy market participation of EVs, RE integration. And then we took policy and regulatory interventions. Again, this is the list of potential interventions that we analyzed: adequate EV charging infrastructure, mandating EV charging infrastructure, in publicly accessible parking locations, building bylaws, land requirements, and other subsidies and other interventions. So then we used our in our methodology, we actually gave the inputs to this decision matrix, which that decision matrix is derived on 3 factors that I mentioned earlier. Stakeholder discussion: we had a over a year, we had the stakeholder discussion with different stakeholders in India particularly, but also in internationally. Secondary data we took from reports, technical report, scientific papers, publications, other sources, and then in-house analysis, and then we arrived at the distant metrics, which we gave as an input to the overall framework that I was mentioning in the previous slide. And then this is the ranking of the interventionists, technical interventionists. Time-based AV tariff turned out to be the top ranking intervention because it is simple to implement. We don't need communication infrastructure for this. Only tariff regulations are required for time-based AV tariff, and if it convinces the AV user, it will definitely have an impact on this EV adoption. RE integration, RE-based charging and integration of RE was the second rank intervention. Then we have smart charging B1G and interoperability on the third position, then fast charging infrastructure fourth, so on and so forth. Then we had policy and regulatory intervention. This is the ranking for policy and regulatory intervention that we got from this particular analysis, with building bylaws being the top ranking intervention here, followed by market creation and aggressive awareness, as I was mentioning. So what we did is then we put together the top 5 ranking interventions from both the sides, and as I mentioned it, arrived at final ranking, and we did some in-depth analysis also of some of the interventions. For example, you see here time-based AV tariff. We took here around 20 chargers. No, sorry, around 40 chargers. There are 40 residential customers here in this feeder. You can see this the conventional load, and then we use a time update tariff which is applicable in Kerala. This is home charging. What we found is, if we look at the savings, annual savings, we found it ranging from, this is the TOD time update tariff, and we also use an aggressive time update tariff. And you can see here the savings on using this time update tariff, is depending on whether it is standard time update tariff or aggressive time update tariff. You can have as high as 17,500 per charger or per EV user. Payback period for this is for 3 kilowatt charger, it is around 2 years. For 7 kilowatt, it is around within 1 year, and 11 kilowatt within 1 year. But what it also, this time update tariff helped actually is, if you look at this load profile of this feeder, if we add EV load, it is going to overload during the peak period. But if we use a time update tariff, you can see that we are avoiding the overloading during the peak loading conditions, and we are able to distribute that charging needs to the off-peak load and help in. So what is happening is grid operator is getting benefited by having less peak load, and EV user is getting benefited by having some savings out of it. So that's how this small case study is actually showing. Then we did with the public charging infrastructure similar results here as well. We took different scenarios of this business model for the public charging station, and then accordingly we have different utilization factors, 10%, 27%, and the savings or the profit varies depending on which mode you are actually adopting. We took fast charging infrastructure case study also. In the interest of time, I think I will have to run little quick now. And you can see here, if we have slow chargers, we are having higher utilization for slow chargers, but the problem with it is that we will end up, if we are considering 25 vehicles for this, we will end up having several electric vehicles which are not being served with the charging requirements. But for fast chargers, there is all the electric vehicles are getting served. Similarly, if we have, so what it is actually showing is, for fast chargers, we are able to serve more electric vehicles. So therefore, you are having better opportunity to actually, if you have a better utilization factor for fast chargers, there's a more business and revenue opportunity for that. This slide I will skip here. So in-depth analysis of this mandating EV charging infrastructure in building bylaws. So what we did is in this analysis, again, we took 60 chargers in this case study, where we are actually having this marking these parking locations using them as a charging infrastructure for the electric vehicles of the building. And you can see here, depending on different modes of the selling electric prices for charging electric vehicles, there is different NPV rates here, and payback period is accordingly. So this also shows that there is a business case for by adding this building bylaws in the EV ecosystem for the building applications, electric vehicle applications in the building. Then we have support market creation for private investment. We have done one case study here as well. So what we analyzed is that simply a subsidy is not going to make the business profitable. There are other factors that need to be actually taken into consideration, which will make sustainable this charging infrastructure business. Easy access of land is another aspect that we considered, and where in this particular case study we considered this co-locating PCS with other existing businesses, and this is the case study in that direction. And this table summarizes different charging infrastructures in different locations. Let us say private charging infrastructure, workplace, and public charging infrastructure. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we had this technical and regulatory interventions. So what we did is we took these different performance criteria: number of EVs served, cost of charging electric vehicles, EV ecosystem benefit, implementation time, and then we try to actually rank these different interventions. For example, if you look at this managing EV charging infrastructure in building bylaws, so we can see that the number of EVs served is high, it's very good. And also EV ecosystem is benefiting because we're putting more EV chargers in the system. Similarly, if you look at the interoperability, very important actually intervention. You see here three these performance criteria are actually matching here. It's very good for three factors, but it is poor for the implementation part. So if implementation part is improved, interoperability will turn out to be one of the critical intervention. So this is the final ranking of the intervention is that we have managing EV charging infrastructure in building bylaws, in introduction of time-based EV tariff, use of RE-based EV charging, focus on fast charging, development of smart charging, support distribution system upgradation, easy access of land for setting public charging stations, aggressive awareness, and support market creation for private investment in public charging infrastructure. And then followed by interoperability. But as I mentioned, interoperability is one of the critical factors if implementation time is actually increased. In the interest of time, I will skip this section of this presentation, which was talking about the implementation, how we can implement these interventions, and hopefully we will have more detailed discussion on these at a later stage when we'll have a workshop on the report 4 down the line, and then we will detail out further analysis out of those workshops and dissemination events. So in conclusion, we can say that this study is actually adopting a scientific based approach along with the inputs from the key stakeholders, industry, and other surveys, and also we have analyzed critical analysis of different gaps have been actually conducted for the electric vehicle charging infrastructure in Indian EV ecosystem. Guidelines for implementation of these interventions have been provided. These are the published 3 reports. Those who are interested in getting more details of this study actually can access these reports and have a detailed look on that. So while I stop my presentation, we have one request for the audience, that based on this analysis that we have and the findings that we have so far, we would request your feedback through a survey that will be posted on the chat box of this platform. So after this presentation, while we enter into the next set of the agenda item of this workshop, we would request all the participants to participate in this short survey, because that is going to provide us useful and constructive inputs to which will help us strengthening our findings from this study further, so that we can come up with the constructive suggestions in the final report, that is report 4. So with this, I would like to conclude my presentation here. Thanks for your patience, and thanks Steve for allowing me to overshoot my time. Over to you, Steve, please.
Thank you so much, sir. You established the foundation for the further discussion ahead. So thank you for that. We discussed over the present EV statistics, the status quo information about the public charging infrastructure in India. We discussed over policies and thereon the gaps within. We also discussed over technical interventions and policy and regulation interventions that could accelerate EV penetration further into the Indian market. So thank you so much for that. Here, so probably we will move on to the panel discussion. Again, I would like to welcome back Professor Zakir, who will be moderating the panel discussion on challenges of EV charging infrastructure and its grid integration in the Indian EV ecosystem and the way forward. Joining him on the panel discussion would be Dr. O.P. Agarwal, Mr. Avdesh Jha, Executive Director, Fortrum Charge and Drive India, and Mr. Ramakrishna Singh, Head EV Charging Operations from Tata Power. Please, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal, Mr. Singh, and Mr. Jha for joining for this interesting panel discussion that we are having today during this workshop. So I think without taking much time, I would request introductory remarks on the major challenges that Indian charging EV ecosystem is actually experiencing, in your opinion, where we need to focus on going forward for seamless adoption of EV charging infrastructure. So broader opening remarks would be helpful. Then we would actually go into the specifics of the details and different questions and related discussions. So I would request Mr. Jha to start with.
Thank you, Professor Zakir. I hope I'm audible, right?
Yes.
Okay. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Definitely, this is an honor for me to share my views. And as a charge point operator, from the presentation which Professor Zakir has just shared, I would pick up 3 important points. So one is the grid connections. While you are applying for charging stations, how quickly we get the grid connections from the discoms, that is very, very relevant. I would say this is much more relevant even than the cost which we are currently required to pay because of the low threshold of the LT side connections. So that is one important challenges which we are facing as a charge point operator for a rapid expansion of the public charging stations. That's number one. The number two, which incidentally Professor Zakir has said that the TOD tariff is the ranking 1, though I have a contrarian view here, because for a public charging stations, we believe that time of the day tariff would be a very, very discouraging for the time of, for the public charging stations. While this would be good for the home charging, but for a public charging, imagine that the peak time is or the non-peak time is during the midnight, and in the midnight no individual would come to the charging stations for charging the vehicles just because they would get 1 rupee or 2 rupees lesser price. They would not come to the charging stations. In fact, in our Hyderabad operations, we applied artificially this time of the day tariff, where we had lowered our price during the non-peak period, and we did it for 3 months, and we didn't see any change in the behavior of the customers. So where this time of the day tariff would be more suitable, and is that if it is predominantly home charging, yes, there would be applicable, and maybe in the fleet captive operations. But otherwise, so my view is that the time of the day tariff should be applied judiciously. This should be done by the sector wise, not blindly that we regulate the time of the tariff and every public charging station has to apply that one. So public charging stations, they should understand the profile of the users, the preference of the users, and we don't have any control on that, because for 1 rupee, 2 rupee, nobody would come in the night 10 o'clock and then keep their vehicles parked there for up to 2 o'clock. So, and same goes with the fleet. Fleet will not come to any common public charging station during the midnight. They can do it at their home depot or the captive, but not at the public charging stations. So the time of day, while we are applying the time of day tariff, this is very, very good interventions, but it should be done strictly for the captive or for the home charging, or maybe the workplace charging, but not for the public charging, because that would, I would say, put a major deterrent for the public charging stations. And the third point, which I would pick up, is the RE integrations. When we are talking about the RE integrations, the government has done a fantastic job by bringing on new regulations on the open access. This has allowed or opened the opportunity for accessing the green energy, which is very, very relevant. But there are certain things which government is required to do, or particularly the regulators are required to do, is that, in the EV charging, we can't schedule the power. You can't say that at this particular 15 minutes block or half an hour block, my load would be this much. Now, that is where it is important that it should be 100% based on the banking and not on the scheduling. Because if you allow for the scheduling and then you say that next day at exactly at the same time you have to consume it, that's not feasible in the EV charging. So these are the 3 concerns or 3 points, I would say, at the introductory, and then I'll be happy to take further questions there. Back to you, Zakir.
Thanks, Mr. Jha. So I would request now Dr. Agarwal to provide his comments. Dr. Agarwal is one of the well-known, experienced, expert in the transportation sector, and he has also been associated with review and other related aspects of our study. So I would request him to provide the opening remarks on this question.
Thanks, Professor Zakir. First of all, I would like to compliment the team for this report. Your presentation was also outstanding. The report itself has been outstanding. There's very little work I have seen being done on the supply side of energy. A lot of the emphasis so far has been on the vehicle, but I think the supply side has been not got the kind of attention that it probably should have. And I feel part of the reason is because we didn't expect this kind of a rapid growth in electrification. And I remember even 4 or 5 years ago, this number of 2 million that we showed in your slides, I think seemed far more distant. So that's I think a growth that we didn't expect, and it's a growth that is really encouraging. A couple of things I want to mention here is that, one, we should look at electrification of vehicles in India, not necessarily the way the West has looked at it. And I feel a lot of our focus should not be on what percentage of vehicles have become electric, but can we look at what percentage of vehicle miles have become electric? Because benefits don't flow out of vehicles becoming electric, much more of vehicle miles becoming electric. Now, the beauty of looking at this is if you look at vehicles which do more miles per day, the kind of charging locations you'll be looking for are a lot more concentrated. For a city, you don't need a very widely dispersed network of public charging stations if you're looking at only personal vehicles becoming electric. But when you focus on fleets, you focus on urban freight vehicles, you focus on public transport vehicles, the charging requirements for them are a lot more concentrated, limited locations. And I feel they make a good nucleus for further growth to take place. So, and a lot of these, and I agree with Mr. Jha that, public charging stations, particularly if it is aimed at personal owned vehicles, time of day may not be very useful because no one will go at midnight to charge. But fleets will benefit a lot from that. And particularly if we're looking at swapping, swapping stations, these are the kind of people who will be charging in bulk, and there are economic advantages to them when they take advantage of the time of day meters. So that's one. The other point I wanted to make is, it's not just about how much electricity is needed, what will be the additional demand for electricity at different levels of EV penetration. I think a larger concern, particularly if you're looking at fleet vehicles, is the instantaneous load. So most of them will be operating throughout the day. So the charging window for many of them will be narrow. For personal vehicle, charging windows can be much broader. So that's something that we need to look at. How is the instantaneous load affected? Recently there was this tender for electric buses, an aggregated tender for electric buses. And what emerged from that was the prices that were received were lower than the prices for diesel and lower than the prices for a smaller volume of electric buses. Now, that again is a very encouraging trend that we've seen. But the difficulty that we are beginning to see is it's not just the grid capacity or the charging capacity in the bus depot. It's also about the capacity of the transformer just outside the depot. Is that able to supply the depot? So there may be a need for DISCOMs to start looking at enhancing those capacities. There will be a question of the DISCOMs' financial strength to be able to do that. But I think this is where programs like the Smart Cities mission, for example, they should be leveraged to get financing for that kind of a thing. Electric mobility, it should be a feature of the Smart Cities mission. And these kind of things could be able to provide some funds for that. The other point you made was excellent. Personal vehicles are parked for 96% of the day. And can they not be stationary storage that can benefit RE itself? So I think great points. I would say great points. Let me sort of stop my opening remarks here, but we'll come back again later. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Agarwal. So I would now request Mr. Singh, who is heading important business of charging at Tata Power, to say his opening remarks.
So very good evening, Dr. Zakir, and thank you for inviting me part of this panel discussion. And good evening to fellow panelists and the enthusiasts of EV ecosystem who are on the teams. So very good evening. And I think Dr. Zakir and his team has done fantastic job to do a very exhaustive study on EV ecosystem, bring out the various challenges, and even suggested very important remedial measures also. And I think in due course, those will get implemented on ground. Then the opening remark on this charging infrastructure challenges, primarily, even though government is doing a lot of policy intervention, but major challenge is on implementing on the ground. So one of the key aspect I would like to highlight here is that how a regulator can adopt those key recommendation of Niti Aayog or MOP or CA, until unless state regulators who are the regulating the various private or government state DISCOMs, they bring out that a statutory requirement or recommendation for implementing infrastructure or intervention for requiring for the EV ecosystem, those would not get implemented easily. So that is one of the key. Apart from that, power connection in fact comes under part of that only. That even though Ministry of Power has highlighted that in major cities or A-class cities, it should get power connection should be released within 7 days, but it takes, even major cities, it takes months together because of certain constraints. So another important part is telecom communication network availability across India. That is another challenge, despite the good presence of various network operators. Because we are present across India, Kashmir to Kanyakumari, east to western part of Porbandar, and we find in various challenges in some of the highways, state highways or major highways, that there are fluctuations in the network. So we need the communication network stability, or alternatively some other communication mode of communicating with the devices or with the customers or with the this charging infrastructure. Then one of the one of the major another bottleneck or maybe the challenge is how we minimize or optimize the tariff of charging, because this has to be very cost effective. 20, 25 rupees, 30 rupees. Sometimes people feel it is more. But considering the investment, I think most of the CPOs are not recovering even cost of infrastructure or investment with the prevailing tariff. So how do we optimize that cost of tariff? Maybe some public investment or government investment into the basic infrastructure can substantially bring down the cost. If you take the example of US, where there's a very good penetration of electric vehicle and charging infrastructure, the government is spending a lot of good amount of money in building up the charging infrastructure. They are giving 40, 50, even 60% of grant to the public for setting up the charging infrastructure. So that is another key important part, that how do we optimize the tariff so that the people at large can avail the public charging infrastructure for charging their vehicle. And another could be like you talked about time of day. One of the criteria or the tool or the input could be the battery storage along with the time of day. So that this can be one of the remedial measure for bringing down the cost or for enhancing the charging infrastructure adoption. That how we can deploy the battery charging battery storage, in fact battery storage along with the TOD to optimize the overall costing of the tariff. And one more important part in the part of tariff, Mr. Jha also touched upon that portion, that we need to have a single part tariff. Still in many states they have the two-part tariff, wherein there are certain demand charges and then there is a tariff. So demand charges, if utilization low, demand charges, because of demand charges your input cost goes 30, 40, 50 rupees a unit. So I think that could be another facility which can be done through the regulatory policy advocacy. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Ramakrishna. Thank you, all the experts, for your opening remarks. Coming back to now Mr. Jha's comment on TOD, to some extent it has been touched upon by other experts as well. So I agree with you that time of day tariff should be designed in such a way that it actually benefits the whole EV ecosystem as a whole, and there may not be a single time of day tariff structure, adequate for all the sectors. So time of day, it means it didn't mean that it's always lower at night. it will be lower at the daytime also during the off-peak hours. Let us say, 12 p.m., 1 p.m., depending on the load profile of that particular area. And the time of day tariff is also being used in some countries for some other applications, for grid management applications. For example, in California, they have designed time of day tariff to address the duck curve issue that many of us are actually familiar with. So therefore, I agree that time of day tariff should be designed carefully, keeping the interest of all the key stakeholders in view. But from different perspective, it comes out to be an easy to implement and having much more implications on different aspects of this entire EV ecosystem adoption. Now, coming back to your scheduling part, which you mentioned regarding the green open access. I do agree with you that scheduling of EV load is not an easy task. That too at this stage. At the early stage, it may not be easy. It will be difficult. But at a later stage, if we look from, I'm actually putting the perspective of the DISCOM here as well. DISCOM will have, as we go for higher EV penetration, will have significant load coming from, at least instantaneous load, as Dr. Opiagar was mentioning, will come from the EV side as well, particularly in the regions where we'll have high EV penetration. So they need to actually have the schedule, they need to have the planning of the load. So there, maybe I'm actually not as a moderator mentioning this, but I'm mentioning from a perspective of what I believe would be the DISCOM's perspective. They need to have some estimate of the EV charging load to plan their grid in a better way, rather than simply leaving it to whatever number of EVs would come and actually they need to be charged. I think that those factors would also actually come into picture when we talk about whether there should be scheduling of EV load or not. I would stop here and yeah, please.
Yeah. So, Professor Jagur, a couple of points. So, I agree that these are challenging for the DISCOMs, for the regulator as well. But what I'm trying to say, we are in the regulation also, in the policy framing, we are generally used to act in a particular way because we have been conditioned a period of time to act in that way. I'm saying EV is a different kind of a category, which cannot be. See, we have seen that even for solar operators, it was very difficult to schedule exactly in those 15 minutes because it was very much dependent on the radiations. But still, basis certain model, because there the variability is only the nature, right? Now, in the EV, the question is and this I'm talking to particularly in the public charging reference. I'm not talking of captive, I'm not talking of the home. But in the public charging, the variable is the human. Now, when human would come to a particular charging stations, I don't think on the earth, whether you have a machine learning, algorithm, AI, everything you put in there, you can't predict precisely that I will go at these charging stations at this particular point of time, right? So what I'm saying that, yes, it is good to have the schedule that will make everybody's life easier. But as a country, we should understand that this is a different a business. And in this business, what could be the other alternative wage? Because in the process of implementing something which you feel that it is easy to implement, we should not kill the business itself. And as you rightly said in your report itself, that the public charging in India, particularly for the four-wheeler segment I am talking about, is critical. If it is not there, probably the adoption will not happen in the public charging, in the car segment. Now, if that is the case, in that case, then we must, all the stakeholders put together, understand each other's concerns and try to find some wage by which, I don't have any solutions for that one, but this is the problem which we need to be aware of, and we should, with the open mind, we should try to find a solution for that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Mr. Jha. So we would move to the next question, related question, which I would start with Mr. Ramakrishna. Grid upgradation or grid connection for public charging stations. How you, as a grid, as a charging point operator, you see is critical, is important, is impacting you as a charge point operator? How do you see what should be the way forward to address this grid upgradation costs?
Dr. Jakir, it is a very valid point you have raised. In fact, if you see, India has been upgrading its network in last 20 years. Okay, it started with APDRP, RAPDRP, then the Saubhagya scheme, then Deen Dayal Gramin Vidyuti Karana Yojana. Now it has come as a revamped distribution sector scheme. Okay, RDSS. So under RDSS, Ministry of Power has made the suggestions, even rather recommendation, that one could state-specific discoms can utilize that central grant or funding for augmenting it in the infrastructure for the EV charging requirement. Okay, and now this EV charging, because state discounts are regulated business. Okay, EV charging requirement cannot be put that additional financial burden cannot be put upon the individual customer of those utility. Okay, because those are not getting benefited. So some state is getting benefited, or individual EV owner is getting benefited, or other stakeholders are getting benefited, but not the electricity consumers directly. So I think the state discom and the central ministry can need to work in cohesion, and whatever policies are getting or guidelines are getting released from the Ministry of Power, those should get quickly adopted by the state discoms. Okay, is in a mission mode. The way they are implementing a smart metering scheme or Saubhagya scheme they implemented. Similarly, I think each discom needs to work out the additional load requirement for EV charging basis the penetration or some kind of demand forecast for next 5 years, even though the kind of growth is happening is very rapid. And I think they can take certain kind of algorithm or the mathematical calculation basis the what is the quantity of, or in terms of amount, crude oil is getting converted to the electricity. Okay, so India is importing around 95 billion US billion dollar this crude, and out of which approx 33% goes for the transportation sector, apart from other usage of that crude. So you can think of 30-35 billion equivalent amount of energy is getting converted to the electricity. Okay, so it's not only the network, but even the generation needs to be augmented equally, transmission need to be augmented equally, and the renewables, it could be solar, it could be rooftop solar, it could be wind or local generation to fulfill the need of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So it's a big and a very ambitious program. So I think we need to have the public participation and government state discoms participation along with the EV eco operators, be it charge point operator, be it distribution company, be it regulator, be it Ministry of Power or CA. So everybody need to come into the single platform, and there should be some time-bound framework for deploying this schemes, basis the adoption happening across various cities. So it is not happening across India simultaneously at the same level, but there are certain parts of India which are demanding or witnessing more EV penetration. So I think we need to have that kind of data with us and work out the schedule for implementation and augmenting the power infrastructure network across India.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Singh. Your take on this, Mr. Jha, on grid upgradation part?
Yeah. So see, I appreciate because Mr. Ramakrishna has brought a very interesting insights. That whatever amount we are saving somewhere, we should be deployed in augmenting the infrastructure. It's a fantastic, and I would say that this is a long term because it's not possible that we'll be doing it in the day one. So this is a long term, and the government must consider this as an into active considerations that how we can do that one. While that would take some time, in the short term, what can be done? So I think a couple of things which is very, very relevant for this one. One, I would say it's more from the charger manufacturer and charger operator side. So we know that most of the distribution transformers are not fully loaded all the time. So there are minimum, probably 60-70% of the time it is not fully loaded. Now, can we, at the same time, it is also not possible that every time your charging stations will be always connected. So can there be a situations where you go for only that much of connections, which is available those 60-70% of the time, and manage your charging stations? So what I am trying to say, what you are referred to as smart charging. So I'm saying that the charger manufacturers should invariably invest now into the load balancing systems of the chargers. So the charger should have the feature of load balancing. And as a charge point operator, so let's say if I am setting up a charging stations with the 4 chargers at 8 points, I should not apply for 240 kilowatt of charger. I mean the contracted load. I should apply for 150. Yes, yeah. I would apply for 150 kilowatt. That is the load which the distribution company transformer most of the time has. And within that 150, if there is a 1 hour situations when all the 4 cars are connected, I would regulate the speed of the charging, right? So this is what the charger OEM and the charger CPO should do it in the short term. And that would help because see, as a country on the national basis, we do not have the flexibility or the luxury to invest so much in the expansions and keep the grid unnecessarily unutilized. And that's where the related point I would say, I strongly believe that we should not promote too much of individual home charging. Because just an illustration, in the, let's say you had a 200 inmates multi-story apartments, already that in that society has close to around 2 megawatt of connections load, right? Now you are applying for another 200 if everybody is opting for 7.4 kilowatt AC charging. That what will happen during the night time, these 1-2 megawatt would be connected, but during the daytime, all these cars would be away from the home, and these again the transformers will be underloaded. Now you are again sub-optimizing your investments. So I would recommend that in the home, from the awareness through, we should bring the community charging concepts, where the charging with the help of the valet services, can be managed with a much lesser load. So these kind of things should be allowed through the regulations. That should be facilitated through the regulations and the policy measures. That will give a good, I mean, as a CPO, I don't want any subsidy from the government. That is the last thing I would like to have. But if these kind of enabling frameworks are there, this would go a long way in adoption of the electric vehicle.
Thanks, Mr. Jha. Important point in terms of the regulations, particularly in the context of measuring and calculating the connected load that you mentioned. For the buildings part that you mentioned, it is anyway going to be kind of not necessarily same, but similar to the community charging. You will not have so many chargers. You will not have a space for so many chargers. The equivalent number of the residents that would be there. So it is going to be even limited number of chargers that they will have in the building. But yes, in the home charging, I think that is a good suggestion. Your quick take on these inputs, Dr. Agarwal, before we move to the next question.
Actually, is not an area where I have too much expertise, but I think fascinating discussions. I would sort of leave it at that. But very interesting points that have been brought up on this.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Agarwal. So let us move to the next point, that is in charging infrastructure, which is battery swapping. So in your opinion, of course, there are already developments in the battery swapping space happening in the country. So what is your take on battery swapping vis-a-vis the conventional connected charging infrastructure? I would and the scope of battery swapping in the country. Dr. Agarwal, would you like to start with that?
Okay, yeah. Well, I think in the Indian context, battery swapping is going to be very important. And the reason I'm saying this is multiple. You see, our typical travel distances, I'm more a transport person than an energy person, so I'm bringing it more from the transport perspective. Our travel distances are not very long. And most people tend to feel that, oh, that one day in a year when I may travel longer, just for that, I'm having a battery which will give me a 200-kilometer range or a 250-kilometer range. But then if he has a battery which will give him a 250-kilometer range, he's lugging that weight all the time. So that is a situation we want to try and avoid, because that becomes a waste of energy. It becomes, needlessly expensive. Now, what swapping does is allows the battery to be smaller, but for that one occasion, you are able to have an additional battery or something through some leasing arrangement. That's number one. The second thing is our ambient temperatures are higher than in many of the Western countries. And because the ambient temperatures are higher, the risk of charging in the open, in the ambient situation, that would damage the battery quite a bit. And what swapping tends to do is allow you to charge in a controlled temperature or in a controlled environment. The third is that if you have public charging stations, and which we will of course have, the number of vehicles they can service with a certain area of land is going to be much smaller than on a petrol station, for example. So that's where some arrangement where you can charge on battery banks, which occupy far less land. I think that itself is a great reason for battery swapping. A third reason for battery swapping, of course, battery swapping to my mind is going to be a big problem for larger vehicles, because using a crane or using some kind of a mechanical device to remove the battery, bring it back, can lead to damage of the battery, which is going to be a very expensive proposition. But for smaller vehicles, auto rickshaws, for example, to those kinds of vehicles, swapping can be a great way of letting them operate longer, not waste time on charging during the day or during the time when they can operate. So I, for one, believe that swapping is a very interesting or a very important segment in the country.
Thanks, Dr. Agarwal. Your take on it, Mr. Singh?
Yeah, I think Mr. Agrawal has, suggested very valid point, like how we can optimize the battery sizing of the vehicle, because higher battery sizing, you need a higher charging infrastructure. Okay, higher size, higher load. So maybe we can have more number of charging infrastructure, fast charging, that you also recommended one of under your study, that we need fast chargers, 5-10 minutes charge, which can give them 30-40 kilometers, 50 kilometers. Because if you see, Mr. Agarwal comes from the transportation, 90-95% of the time you are really not traveling from intercities or across states. Most of 90-95% commuters are within the city or within the 50-100 kilometer radius. So for them, if a smaller battery size and faster charging infrastructure can play a big role, even for the fleet charging or for the bus operators for the various transport departments. Right now, the buses are coming with the 200 kilowatt of battery sizing, 150, 100. So if we have shorter battery size and faster charging infrastructure and more number of charging infrastructure. Right now, like in Delhi or in Mumbai, if you see one bus depot has 5-6 megawatt to 10 megawatt kind of load requirement. Okay, that takes a lot of infrastructure and also a lot of stress for the specific DISCOM to manage that kind of load as and when these buses are connected to the system. So if the battery size is less, I think it can save a lot of resources for a nation per se, and also help faster adoption of this charging and the electric vehicle.
Thanks, Mr. Jha, your opinion on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting, I would say, topic, the battery swapping. Personally, I feel that the battery swapping, particularly for the personal mobility segment, would be not successful, whether be it India or anywhere else. See, there are a couple of reasons for that, what I believe. One, I fully agree what Mr. Agarwal said about the technical aspects of these advantages of the battery swapping: quicker time, lesser load, more efficiency. All these are technical things, and nobody can deny that. See, in the personal mobility segment, what I believe is that more than these technicals, what overrides everything is your emotion, is your sentiment attached to these kind of an assets. See, on the vehicle side, on the personal mobility segment, we attach our emotions to these vehicles. We start caring them more than we care for our own body, right? And that's where it is very important for us that if I've invested 20 lakh rupees in a car, what kind of battery is coming in the vehicles? Is this battery safe? Will it be okay? So I think then what it requires then a standardization of the battery and the standardization of all the operators of the battery swapping operator. Now that brings another question, that if the battery can be standardized, will the OEMs allow that one? Because then in the EV, the battery is the main thing. And if you start standardizing the battery in the form factor and others, because this battery swapping operator then will be required to manage only a small amount of inventory, in that case, you are taking away the freedom from the OEMs to customize the experience to the individual users. So that's where I believe that the personal mobility segment, be it two-wheelers or be it four-wheelers, it will not work. Yes, for a three-wheelers like autos, because that's a kind of a commodity, that's a standardized product. It can run like a fantastic. Only thing where we should be aware of, because the battery cost in any case is likely to come down. And the timing of the charging, and once the battery cost is coming, battery technology is also improving. And if the charging time reduces, because these are the two major factors, cost of the vehicles and the charging time. If these two comes down, then whether the current players would opt for the battery swapping or not, that's a bigger question. And since the technology of the battery is also not fully settled yet, that whether we will go for NMC, whether we will go for LFP, whether we will go for solid state, since these things are still evolving, I personally believe that battery swapping still be kind of, yes, we keep doing it till the time there is a clarity there. That's my view on the battery swap.
Thanks, Mr. Jha. The EV OEMs that we have interacted with during this study have had reservations about the battery swapping for different reasons, commercial as well as technical reasons. But let us see. There's development on the swapping also happening in parallel. Maybe they might be supplementing each other as we move forward. So I will start with the next question from you, Mr. Jad, directly now, is about for public charging application, fast charging versus slow charging. So there has been, in Indian EV ecosystem, in terms of, let's say, policy interventions or maybe subsidies, there is an impression that, in at least in some cases, that slow charging should be subsidized more. We should promote slow charging, more. What is your opinion on that? Yeah, I would say about the findings of our study later, but I would like to listen your opinion on that.
Yeah. See, in India, unfortunately, our storytelling and narrative has been not right. See, what we do, when we say public charging, we mix up everything put together, the 2-wheelers, 3-wheelers, 4-wheeler, everything put together. I think all these three segments needs to be looked into as a different segment. And then we start discussing, then it becomes very clear, right? Obviously, for 4-wheeler passenger car, I don't think in the public places, the slow charging makes much more sense. Reason being because the people need to then spend more time even to get a top up of 20%, 30%, 40%. Because if you see the mass car, which currently we have in India, they do not accept more than 3.3 kilowatt of power, right? Now, so in that case, even for getting 10 units of electricity, you require 3 hours to stand there. So and we have seen in Bangalore, and we are doing continuously this experiment on a larger scale. So in Bangalore, in 2 malls, we have set up 50 charging points. So what I was saying, that we have done this experiment in Bangalore, 2 malls, where we have set up 50 charging points. And these charging points are operating for last almost 8 months. There 36 points are AC type 2, 7.4, and remaining are fast chargers of CCS. Now, what we have observed, and these are in the malls, where we expect that people will be spending more time. And we have seen the utilization of the CCS, the AC chargers is very, very low. And the utilization and the preference for the fast charging is very high. So what I feel that in the public charging, we should have 70-30 ratio in favor of fast chargers versus slow chargers. Slow chargers, the reason being because if the public charging, if the fast charger is occupied, people can still connect it till the time the fast charger becomes free, so that they can have some opportunity charging. Otherwise, not as a per se that yes, slow charging should be there in the public. That's my view on the public charging on the car segment.
Thanks, Mr. Jha. Over to you, Mr. Ramakrishna, your opinion based on your experience across the country in the charging infrastructure.
So definitely, see, the slow charging in public domain for 4-wheelers is definitely hardly used, because we have the combination of slow and fast chargers across various locations. And wherever the utilization is high, it's primarily because of fast chargers. And people are demanding more and more of fast chargers rather than slow chargers. So we have kept slow chargers even in some destinations like hotels, resorts, or some destination point. But there also people are demanding for the fast chargers rather than slow chargers. So I think for the public, slow is absolutely hardly they required only in case where the hotels or somebody is staying overnight. There could be the option of slow chargers, AC chargers. But for while public is moving from A to B place, they don't need, they don't at all like to have slow chargers.
Thanks, Mr. Singh. Mr. Rajput has raised his hand. Do we have anything to come, please?
Good evening, sir. Good evening, everybody. I am A.K. Rajput from CEA. I was listening quite attentively, whatsoever part I could, but sorry, I missed some of the part, and particularly in the beginning. So what I understand and my opinion is that electric vehicle systems and electric vehicle service will become a great reality. So I will say this is in the starting stage at the particular moment, but it will be a big service and it has to come. There is a need. And that need could be fulfilled when we have the enough charging stations. For charging stations to be enough, and the point Ramakrishna ji raised that it should be affordable in the sense it should not pinch to the consumers. One thing is that the rates of electricity as set up by the regulator for the electric vehicle supply equipment, they have to be rational, maybe concessional in the beginning, because everywhere the subsidy is given to certain sectors. So here also some subsidy could be there, so that the ultimate service fee which the public charging system, public charging station owner is getting, he can offer a competitive price. As regard to the location of number of, you can say the charging stations, we have to see the which type of the pattern is there in that particular city. Initially, I feel it will be an urban phenomena. Later on, it will go into the rural also. As far as the four-wheelers cars are concerned, and as far as the two-wheelers or e-rickshaws are considered, they will be quite in number, quite large in number, even in smaller cities, smaller towns, and in the rural areas as well. And there is also a fact in India that in rural areas, mostly the people are now at a position that they can afford the two-wheelers easily as compared to a motor car. So with these backgrounds, suppose we have a city in which the airport is also there and the airport caters to large number of flights. So naturally there will be many taxis. So taxi fleets will be there, private taxi operators will be there, and naturally the passenger cars will be there. What is missing in particular this type of the particular discussion is we should make aware and we should be conscious, maybe your reports, because the 4 voluminous reports have come, and we have naturally to go through these reports thoroughly. The consumer behavior need to be studied. What is the preference and what other alternative mode of transportation are there? In case in a city, the metros are there, so there is lesser dependency, lesser mileage of running of the cars or any other type of the transportation system. So we study this, that what is the pattern and what is the pattern at a particular moment. Say hourly pattern we can study, and it can be studied by measuring the consumption or the loading on the public charging systems. So that is one that should be done. Another way is we should make some R&D efforts and other innovations that how we can reduce the cost of the electric vehicle supply equipment, because it's a sizable. Then at the regulatory part, actually it is because the electricity is in the concurrent subject. Power is concurrent subject.
Right.
So there are different regulations for supplying, for releasing the connection. Say in case of Delhi, it is up to 140 kilowatt at LT supply. So it is a lesser burden to the PCS owners. But in other cities, it is say limited only up to 40 kilowatt or 50 kilowatt.
50 kilowatt.
And those supply authorities, those supply utilities insist for that you take the ST connection. So taking a ST connections and bearing the cost of that much infrastructure, that is huge. That gives a big jolt and a deterrent. Another is the land issues. Now the town planning has to change and has to provide, particularly in the new developments and the new sectors where they are getting developed, the proper space for the electric vehicle charging stations. Like they leave the space for schools, say for parks, and say cinema theaters also, they leave the space. They should also leave the space for the public charging stations. So building bylaws need to be
Building
changed.
bylaws, yeah.
And I would request the PCS owners and other stakeholders, the national building code will be revised soon. The process has started. So they be vigilant and write in that what should be the actual requirement. Another thing is standardization. Standardization is a big thing as far as that swapping method of the battery is there. We also offer the comments to our Niti Aayog for their draft policy. Swapping will be successful, say, in case of the three-wheelers. In case of the three-wheelers, most of the three-wheelers are rented one. They are under the fleet is under one ownership, one large ownership. Individual three-wheelers may be less. So there it is successful. But in case of two-wheelers, the people would like that it is my own vehicle. I should have the. So I will be completing in 2 minutes. There is another call also, no problem. So in case of the two-wheelers and say the standard model one has chosen, with great market research and consulting his friends and the nears and dears that which model of the car I should go. So in case of the personal car, people would like to have the battery of his own, get it charged properly. In the swapped model, he will have a fear that at one time I may get an inferior battery and that may cause a danger, say like bursting of the batteries also. So that apprehension will be there. So regulatory part which say stakeholders and this group feels need to be improved. They may write to MOP as well as to CEA. We are ready because the guidelines for charging system came in 14 January 2022. Then recently in the month of November, the amendment was carried out. If something else is required, we are ready to do because we have to promote the e-mobility. And it has to be an integrated efforts. The electricity distribution supply company have to see and have to change their attitude also that they need to serve, that they have to serve in future this type of the loads also. And these loads will be intermittent and their upward distribution network has to cater to the peak demand. So that's all is my offering. I will offer the comments on the report also. I may be contacted at any time. And
Sure, thanks.
And you kindly pardon me that I will be attending another meeting, that is a physical meeting there in the ministry.
So thank you so much. We're glad that you made some time in between your other meetings and gave these constructive, useful inputs. Thanks a lot, Mr. Rajput, for your time and for your inputs. And we will stay in touch with you to get the further feedback on our study, as discussed earlier.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you all that I got an opportunity to listen to very fantastic ideas. Some of the ideas which I was really not knowing, to be very frank. And it is basically we should treat it that this is a learning path for each and everyone. It is not as mature as the IC engine phenomena. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Rajput. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Very valid point from Mr. Rajput. Thank you.
So with this, I would request now concluding remark. Maybe we're already short of time. No, we already overshoot time. Maybe half a minute concluding remark from each of the experts. I would start from Mr. Jha. I think has also requested. He has some other urgent activity to catch up with.
So Mr. Zakir, I would, whatever I have said, on top of that, what I would conclude is that Mr. Rajput is no longer there, but my request would be to Ministry of Power that before issuing any amendment, any guidelines in the infrastructure, guidelines what they issue, they first take the CERC into confidence. and they take them on board, because what is happening, once they issue the guidelines, what the local distribution company does, they pick up those which are favorable to them, they act on that, and those which are not favorable to them, they just don't act on that, because these are guidelines and ministry doesn't have any role on discoms. So if
SCRCs, to be precise,
no, so
CRC.
Ministry of Power will not be taking anything from the CRC. If they can take CRC, because there's one body, and if the CRC, see what I'm saying, Mr. Zaki,
SCRCs, State Electricity Regulatory
then
Council.
automatically SCRC would agree.
Yeah, sure.
Electricity is actually a state subject and is under state control. So it has to done through SCRCs. And directly, that Ministry of Power, Central Ministry of Power can directly connect with the respective state government power department, and that they can get it implemented through them.
Yeah, Mr. Singh, what I'm saying, because if Ministry of Power,
I think we lost you again, Mr. Jha. In the meantime, Mr. Singh, would you like to provide your, because we are running now out of time?
Yeah, so apart from already, I think very valid points we discussed from all the, this panel members. So that one of the key points I wanted to just highlight, that whatever policy guidelines are getting, issued from the ministry should get in time-bound manner. In fact, ministry should issue a timeline for implementing those policies with by every state. So which is not happening. So many of the government policies, when they issue from the central, they have certain time limits. So similarly, it could be defined by the state or central government that they should get implemented in 6 months, 3 months time frame. And also there has to be some kind of statutory guidelines for the network service providers, because this telecom network providers. So many places we are facing those challenges of network not available, and that leads to the inconvenience to the customer who is traveling from a state within the states or A to B place. And then that how we need to work upon the fair pricing or fair tariff for the faster adoption of EV vehicle or EV owners.
Thanks, Mr. Singh. Your take final concluding comment, Mr. Dr. Agarwal.
Well, I would say in conclusion, as Mr. Rajput very rightly said, we are all learning. I think that's a very, very powerful message that he gave, and I think it's a good message that he gave. The one major thing about electric mobility is it's suddenly getting two different segments which have rarely worked together to now start working together. Transport sector and the electricity power sector have never worked together in the past. It's all been transport and the petroleum sector. Now, you're getting into a very different kind of marriage. And that relationship building, I think, is very important. It's also very important that local planning has to get these two communities and also maybe the local municipal bodies, really to coming together to see what are travel patterns like, based on which charging facilities can be located. And then municipal bodies will have to look at whether those locations land is available. So multiple players really come in. At the national level, what they've done is, because multiple ministries are involved, they've set up the mission in the Niti Aayog. But I think that mission in the Niti Aayog needs to be better empowered to be able to facilitate more coordination. One small thing that I would say, which Mr. Rajput came in and I was not able to speak a little about that, fast charging and slow charging. And both Mr. Singh and Mr. Jha spoke in favor of fast charging for personal vehicles. I would say the same also applies for public transport vehicles. If you have buses which have a 200-kilometer range, you could actually have buses with a lower range, but with some options for fast charging on the way. You could look at a lot of suburban traffic on buses.
Charging,
yeah. So this opportunity charging that you talk about will have to be fast charging. So I think the case for fast charging is certainly strong. Let me stop with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal. So thanks a lot for all the panel members, Dr. Agarwal, Mr. Singh, Mr. Jha, Mr. Rajput, who also joined us in between. Thank you so much for giving insightful inputs on this important topic of EV charging infrastructure in Indian EV ecosystem. I am sure that the participants of this workshop benefited tremendously from your discussion points, your inputs, your constructive inputs on this very important topic. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us in the panel discussion. So with this, I would conclude this panel discussion and hand over the activities back to Kshitij for the next agenda item. Over to you, Kshitij.
Thank you so much, sir. This has been really a riveting and a fascinating discussion that happened around the Indian EV ecosystem. A lot of time, Indian EV ecosystem, the discussions happen around the transport considerations and the financing considerations, but the lifeblood of the entire ecosystem, the EV charging infrastructure, sometimes takes a secondary seat. I'm sure our participants learned a lot, got a lot of food for new thought. Thank you so much to our panel members. Unfortunately, we wouldn't be able to make a question answers round because of we are running short of time. I would now like to welcome back Mr. Hendrik Perzon for his closing remarks. Thank you.
I think Professor Rangan joined. We would take his couple of minutes. We'll give to him before you do the concluding remarks.
Good afternoon, and I'm delighted to be here. I just wanted to, Zakir asked me to say a few words, and I think, and looking at the transition in electric mobility and seeing how we are going to interface with the grid, and also see as in the grids, when we have higher renewables, how we are going to look at the charging infrastructure and the strategies. Looking at best practices from across the world, this report and discussions on the report, and using that as a mechanism so that we can see how we ramp up. I think this is extremely important. So I'm hopeful that many of our stakeholders will be using this report. So I think all of us as researchers and academics need to provide much more information in the public domain so that stakeholders can see and can use the best practices which have been tried out in various countries, try to see how we can do vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to grid, and the charging infrastructure, because these studies like this, which are put up by GIZ in the public domain with research organizations across the countries, as well as user agencies, I think would actually pave the way for a smooth transition. And this transition by any means is not going to be easy. We should not underestimate the efforts required. And I think we need to try and have more such studies and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rangan, for joining us and providing your inputs. Over to you, Hendrik.
So thank you all. Thank you, everyone. This lively discussion, I see 140 people. We were in the peak. So this is already showing us how important this topic is and how relevant also for the public. Please believe me when I say that we are taking really some important information on this topic, and these inputs, of course, will benefit also the next report for. On behalf of GIZ and I think IIT Bombay, I can say heartfelt thanks to all the speakers and participants for attending and sharing the valuable insights and knowledge on these topics. Again, Niti Ayong, thank you very much for your support. and the implementation support you're giving us. I think this is very much valuable, and we can feel it every time. Unfortunately, it didn't work out so good today with the joining of Mr. Sinha, but he was there mentally, at least for us. All the participants, Prof. Ranghan, Prof. Zakir, Mr. Ashok, Mr. Jha, Mr. Singh, Dr. Agarwal, thank you again also for your inputs for the panel, the panelists. It was very good. Have a good evening. We are 8 minutes overdue, and we can close the session. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening.